In this episode of Airs for Architecture, Swati Chattopadhyay of University of California, Santa Barbara speaks about Small Spaces, Recasting the Architecture of Empire, which she published with Bloomsbury last year.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Professor Swati Chattopadhyay. Thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. And we're going to talk about your book, but perhaps before your recent book, your new book, Small Spaces, Recasting the Architecture of Empire. But perhaps before we get into that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself a little more accurately and fully?
Well, I'm very happy to join this podcast. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I am trained as an architect first before I became an architectural historian. So I practiced, I finished my BArch, I practiced, then I did an MArch. And then my faculty at the University of Arizona, Tucson, suggested I do a PhD. And I wasn't sure why I should do that because I was going to practice. But then one thing led to another, and I ended up doing a PhD at Berkeley. And I have been at UC Santa Barbara since my graduation from the PhD program there. And so I am a confirmed Santa Barbarian, you can say. But I also, grew up in Calcutta, lived in Delhi. The number of times I visit London, people think I live in London, which is not true. So my work and thinking has been actually influenced by all of these locations where I have lived, taught, and worked.
Wonderful. So did you study in Delhi?
No, I did not study in Delhi. I worked in Delhi as an architect.
Did you? And who did you work for?
It was C.P. Kukreja and Associates, a big firm. And I worked there for 3 years. And I also did actually something interesting, which was there was a journal, the first architectural professional journal, Architecture Plus Design. And I was the architectural consultant for that, which gave me a fondness for architectural publishing that I had not encountered before, and that I followed up later. At present, I'm one of the co-editors of Platform, the online venue for discussions of architecture, space, broadly speaking. Mm-hmm. And before that, I was the editor of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, the main disciplinary journal. And I think those interests and what you do with publishing, and that's why I was actually very keen to be participate in this podcast, is because how we talk about architecture is the mode is just as important as the content. So it interests me of how architectural publishing and architectural discourse has changed over, I can certainly recount 30 to 40 years. So I find that fascinating, and I have a deep investment in it to reach audiences that normally we would not, beyond our classrooms, beyond the people who read our books. So
that's really interesting. I want to ask about your PhD, but I think that's what you've just been saying is a kind of really interesting into talking about your book, which is also about reaching beyond the canon, so to speak, of how we talk about the architecture of empire, the process of empire building, and starting to, I suppose, flip it on its head in a little bit of a way. It's an inelegant way of putting it, but perhaps you could explain it a little better. I mean, I hope you wrote it.
Right. Since I in myself invoked, 30 or 40 years, when I did my undergrad architecture, paid very little attention to history, like which architecture student does, right? Architectural history is something that you kind of have to sit through. But, in our defense, at least I'm talking about me and my cohorts, we were reading Bannister Fletcher and, Ferguson. I mean, why would you be interested in that, right? There were no, Spiro Kostov's, World Survey was not out for us at that time. It came out just after that. So I encountered it in my MArch. I said, you can actually say, tell nice stories about the history of architecture. That's actually good to read. I think I changed, we did a lot of on-site documentation and trying to figure out how to tell these stories of buildings. One was actually the school and then university complex, Shantiniketan, that was founded by the poet Rabindranath Tagore in Bengal, and it's a rural area. It's really beautiful buildings and so on and so forth. So when I did that work with my cohort in my undergrad, I did my undergrad in Calcutta, it was actually a great way of learning, but we didn't know how to do research, really. We didn't know how to do architectural history. In other words, we were kind of cobbling together a method. I think that was still very important in terms of learning the nitty-gritty of how you go about doing architectural investigation, how you learn to see a building. You learn to see a building quite differently. And we were all on our own. I think it changed my mind truly about architectural history after coming to Berkeley and getting introduced to the work of Del Upton, who became my advisor.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah. So I think that I was always interested in social issues and architecture, the social content of architecture. But being comfortable looking at ordinary buildings and the wonderful stories you can tell about ordinary buildings is a lesson I think me and my cohort in the PhD program at Berkeley learned from Dell. And there were others, Paul Groth, there were lots of, people who could help you think through those. I always say, and it's in the introduction of my Small Spaces book, I think my fondness for small spaces and small things were honed during my PhD work at Berkeley by the faculty and also by colleagues who we had wonderful conversations about, let's say, sort of how goods were stacked in grocery stores, and we would like to talk of, think of that chunk of space. In other words, thinking about space not only in terms of, it doesn't have to be a building, it doesn't even have to be an urban plan. It can be any space. So my understanding of architecture is extremely generous. For me, it's all architecture. If it's space, it's architecture. So for me, and I write about this in the book, a medicine cabinet, it has spatial qualities. So that's space that I can think of. You may not be able to inhabit that space. Like a person cannot go inside, but it is the stuff that makes habitation possible, right? You carry it with you. In other words, portable goods can be very spatial, right? Because you construct space around them. They can be the nuclei of space making or place making. So I think those were, in some ways, this book is a return to work I started thinking about at least 30 years ago. But, was always in the margins of other projects, the major research projects that this is the only project that, didn't get a grant. In other words, I never applied for a grant because I was just working on it, slowly. And I think it's a kind of project which came together slowly as my thinking about architecture and space changed, and I would dare say became more sophisticated. At least I learned to think more creatively about how to introduce characters who are never given importance or any significance in traditional architectural histories. And we can cite many of those. And it's not simply about even big buildings or, historical narratives remain about great men, greater battles, and grand narratives. And, it has to be like, the big thing that can capture your imagination. All we can think of is, we all know this as in architects and architectural historians, Daniel Burnham saying, what did he say? I have it written down. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Even if we bracket the stir men's blood, okay, the masculinist, prerogative of architectural history and planning, that is also, he's voicing imperialist ambition. only recently have we learned to even look at that as imperial ambition.
Mm.
It's stuff of modern architecture and planning. How were we so blind that, it's only recently we are looking at that? So I'm interested in, as an architect, I was very much raised within a modernist ethos. To be very plain, it was really a Bauhaus ethos. Okay, that's our design training. To work through that, to work beyond it, took some thinking and training. Why have we not learned to see or read the imperialist ambitions of most of architecture, most of certain modern architecture? Why has it been so difficult? And I think, it's what I call the aura of bigness has never left architectural imagination. That's what he was talking about. Like, think big, small things don't matter, right? I say think small. That's what really matters. And the aura of bigness has actually bled into all kinds of historical imagination. So he was not an exception by any means. It was not simply that he was a product of his time. Burnham was also, in some way you could say, inherited, way of thinking about history and architecture, but also had inherited thinking way about space that had a long remit, long 20th century and 21st century remit. But what also interests me, I think, is that aura of bigness has also bled into historical imagination per se. In other words, think of how we, our current crisis. It's a crisis of scale and scalar imagination. So, the threat caused by the Anthropocene. We have to think about big histories, big time, and then global histories. How do you think about global histories? I call these scalar anxieties. And they are all sort of pervaded by this aura of bigness. It's like a geological and planetary sublime. And so my work is, this book is very much not just in conversation, but refutation of that mode of thinking, the privileging of bigness as a desideratum, as something one must do. Because I think what has been elided in thinking about big histories like planetary histories, Anthropocene, is that so much of imperialist thinking has gone into that mode of thought. And we have not been able to really kind of separate them out. Like, why do big histories of empire and, histories of Anthropocene have so much in terms of privileging of the big? I think that if I have to say, why is this book important now? It is because I think we have hit a crisis in scalar imagination and really need to think carefully about what we are privileging, who we are privileging, who gets to create value in scale. How do we privilege scale? Which scale do we privilege? In other words, new universals have been brought in without much attention to how they connect to and relate to imperialist histories. So the work is on empire, and mostly British Empire, but I'm also very much talking about what I call imperialist thinking, which pervades modern architecture. You can go to the 19th century, go to 20th century, and we can talk more about, I love talking about service spaces, but again, there are some obvious ways of thinking about in modern architecture in terms of service spaces. Why are service spaces always hidden? Why are they at the back? Why did Louis Kahn, of all people, and I'm a great fan of Kahn, make a distinction between servant spaces and service spaces? And, nobody at that time, nobody has since mentioned that pretty awful distinction in terms of, thinking of this is actually, spaces of the enslaved and master spaces. That's what we're talking about. That kind of thinking is absolutely, embedded and ingrained in architectural thinking. And, and that I would say, doesn't matter which part of the world you're talking about. because that's our habit of imagining architecture in space.
I think that's a really interesting. I love this phrase of scalar anxieties of the contemporary period, and I do think you've answered a lot of the kind of thoughts I'd had about the timeliness of the book, the reason for this book now, and it struck me when I came across it that there was this idea of smallness is very, as you say, it's very required. But this idea of abstraction and alienation and abstraction being inherent to the modernist condition, and this scale issue around, particularly the way you set out at the beginning of the book, in the introduction, you set out talking about the kind of the imperial project through its maps and plans, these kind of. And it was really strange, actually, because, you talk about one particular map, and I can't remember its name now, at the very beginning.
So this is Parkinson's map.
Yeah.
The federal,
And I had actually used
Federation,
I'd used an image of it at the beginning of a lecture about mapping that I gave at lunch yesterday, just to talk about the idea of maps communicating narratives rather than facts, and or necessarily facts. But so I really like this. So I'm kind of interested in this idea of the modernist project working at this kind of crazy scale, like the way we talk about sustainability and environmentalism at the scale of the global. And it kind of like, what the hell does that mean? Like, what are we to do with this? Where can we put this?
Exactly.
And at the same time, empire is presented in this kind of extremely strange way of this kind of grand, romantic, opportunistic, righteous, moral campaign that doesn't really have any meaning at the level at which it is experienced. And your book, I mean, is that a fair statement? Is that a fair comment? And your book is seeking to kind of find the actual complexity within that avatar of an image.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the thing is that, those maps, this is, Parkinson's map, in this Imperial Federation map. Yeah. It's very interesting, that map, because it has all the margins are interesting, the visual iconography of the margins are interesting. There were different versions of that map. But what interested me in that, and it's used so frequently, it's very well known, cartographic image, is that it shows all the communication lines. It shows where you fuel. It shows telegraph lines, railway lines, etc. And the different shades of pink, red. It's about more developed, less developed. It's not developable. Like you can't develop that space. But it presents empire in such a coherent form, as if it's already a fact. So what I'm refuting is the geographic fact of empire. That it can be neatly mapped, what 2/5 of the planet is the empire, etc. No, it was fragile. It was incoherent. Okay, empire was terribly incoherent. Okay, so these rhetorical means of making empire look like one project, one thing that can in Conrad's language, one can bow down to, think like in other words, you can you can sort of pay obeisance to, you can find your little foot in it. I think it's not just a version of 19th and 20th century imperialism. It's much more I would say problematic and injurious. Let me rephrase that. It's much more problematic and insidious, okay, than just, if it was just rhetorical, if it's just 19th century, we could leave it, in the past, like, okay, fine. It's racialized, it's a particular, kind of hubris of empire. But what concerns me is that way of thinking about connections, about trade, about territory, has not left us.
No.
It has over the years gained new momentum, if you will. Every 20 years we see a resurgence. We are seeing a resurgence now. I mean, look at around the world. It's what's happening. It's imperial ambitions being, unfolding imperial ambitions. And it's that's what interests me, is to question that geographical certainty that maps such as those offered, posed.
And to question, and so the means by which you question it is to go into these small spaces. And you started off talking about medicine cabinet. This is the scale that we're talking about here, isn't it? Or are we, or is it from that all the way up to the building? Like, what is I guess, yeah, what is a small space?
It's a very pertinent question in terms of the book. And I make a distinction between size and scale. So, I look at the medicine cabinet, but, I'm looking at other spaces, many of the storage spaces, okay? And the term in both South Asia and East Asia was go down, these large warehouses. And the go downs could be fairly small. It could be an 8 by 10 room, or it could be really large spaces. I mean, like the tea and opium go downs in Calcutta were the size of a city block. That's how large. In other words, it's not, the small spaces I'm talking about are not always dimensionally small. Some of them are. The medicine cabinet is, right? The medicine box of medicine. I'm talking about a particularly box of homeopathic medicine. But some of the spaces are absolutely dimensionally small, like the cook rooms I talk about. They're not kitchens, they're cook rooms, because the cook presides over the preparation of the meal, and it's separate from the house. I talk about these strange spaces, which I had never encountered before myself, called the bottle corner. I found it in the archive. I was like, what does that even mean? It turns out to be a storage space, but it has a storied sort of history. It's very interesting by itself. But I make a distinction between size, dimension, because I'm talking about spaces, objects of various dimensions, and scale. Scale is, of course, a relational issue. But, let's think about this. Every architecture student is taught how to think about scale, right? Mm-hmm. Because you have to think about proportionality, about the real thing in the world, the building, and how it's represented, let's say, in a plan, right? You scale down, right? But you're trying to retain some proportionality. We do scale models, right? And you're scaling down. And we know, apart from all the images we can think of, Le Corbusier's hand on the model, the sort of iconic modernist moment, right? Is that in scaling up and down, you do the trick of erasure. In other words, you erase content, you erase people. And whenever you're moving from one scale to another, when it's not done conscientiously, carefully, sort of with a great deal of introspection, we erase entire histories. That is what I'm bringing into question here, is that this is what I call the scalar imagination. And when we move from one scale to another, something happens, something interesting happens, and we need to pay attention to what happens. Let's think about this, okay? Let's say, the way we are having this conversation, you're in your own room, I'm in my own room, and we're having this conversation. So we are relating across vast space, but we are in our micro spaces, in our room spaces. So how do we connect these two histories? So if you think about, all the sort of the digital links that, at the massive scale, right? But they are actually very, think of the digital and the communication networks that connect us, and how do they sit in relation to the spaces, the physical spaces which we're inhabiting, as opposed to the digital space. There is something that kicks in terms of what I call alterity, the otherness kicks in. Okay, and I can never really get to know the space you're sitting in, and you will never get to see. In other words, there is a barrier, right? And how do we think of this barrier? God knows, for 2 years of COVID, we had lots of time to think about what those barriers are, right? But those barriers are real. Mm-hmm. So my goal in this book is to, when I move scale, let's say, move from one small space or an aggregate of spaces and then a different space, which is actually dimensionally very large. What am I doing? What operations am I doing? What am I subjecting the narrative to? In other words, what am I privileging in making certain connections, in jumping scale, or reducing the scalar relation, diminishing it? What am I doing? I think that's something in terms of, and I'm just talking about architectural history, we need to be extremely attentive to, because we have not been attentive to that. We have taken scale as a kind of a given. We have never questioned our scalar existence, okay, our scalar assumptions, and I think it's very very fundamental to architecture. We think through scale, but we are never conscientious about it.
Yeah.
That's the problem that I have learned to recognize.
Yeah, I really understand. Yeah, I understand that a lot. I mean, we're very casual with it, aren't we? And there's a lot of assumptions in it. Why is, I suppose one might have approached talking about this issue through a number of things, but you've approached, because that's a very fascinating idea, and it could be just as equally applied as a concept to the problem around creating socially sustainable or economically sustainable homes. This issue around scale, like why are urban settlements so barren? New build urban settlements so barren because they're drawn at the scale which privileges a certain kind of organization of space, and no one's ever moving in closer because you don't need to, because you can get planning permission and the contractors just chuck the stuff out anyway, so it doesn't really make any difference. So we could apply it there, but you've applied it specifically to sort of unpacking the making of the imperial world.
Mm-hmm.
What does it? Why that world? And I mean, setting aside perhaps that being a rather asinine question, but what does it, I suppose, teach us most about that world? What does this kind of refocusing on the minutiae of that world, of scale, teach us in this context?
I think let me make sure I'm clear about this. In some instances, I'm thinking about the minutiae, and you could, in some instances, I am writing micro histories, specific histories of people in one space, trying to give, sort of meaning, significance to one character, one space. Other times I'm not. My book is not a microhistory.
No.
So, in other words, I am trying to think about why certain connections are privileged. Let me give you an example, because I drew inspiration from that work. Elizabeth Crumley, American historian, architectural historian, she wrote a very good book called The Food Axis. And she was looking at in Americans from colonial houses to 20th century houses about the space of food production, food consumption. And she made a very convincing argument that that axis, the axis of production and consumption, is the central axis of the American home. It wasn't, I don't think she changed anybody's mind, despite an exceptionally good research, that it is the central spine, because you always think about, well, no, it's a parlor, it's the main spaces. I mean, in other words, you're already thinking about the male spaces as most important, not the ones which are, space of women and servants and the enslaved, because that cannot be the central axis, because then what happens to the male prerogative of the domestic space and so on and so forth. So if we have to make connections between spaces, okay, just let's think about the house, okay? How do we tell that story? In other words, should we privilege the main spaces or the back spaces, the spaces of where actual labor happens? So my strategy in this book is to what I call de-link some of those assumed connections. Oh, we have to start thinking about a house, how he entered the house. And then you have the main space, the living room or the parlor or whatever. I don't go there. I will start at the most unprivileged space. Let's talk about the outhouse. Okay. An outhouse meant different things. It could mean actually a toilet, or it could mean servants' quarters and service spaces. What happens if we start there to think about the house and not? So in other words, the vantage is important, where you start, rather than the main space, if you start in one of the marginalized spaces. But then what you connect it with? So in one instance, that I'm looking at this space that was called Cook Room that I already mentioned, it was located outside. This is an Anglo-Indian, colonial houses. It would be located outside the main house because it had to be farthest away from polite spaces, all the smoke and the smell, etc. You could not admit that in the main house. And this is a pattern also in colonial houses elsewhere. And I actually link that space of labor, with the food crisis of the 1876-78 famine called the Madras famine, and how once you bring those two together, you find connections that you would have never imagined before. There are histories of the Madras famine. Well, there are no histories of the Cook Room, but you could say, well, why bother, right? And it's a small space. What really important happened there? For me, if you want to really understand what is the politics of food in a colonial regime under colonialism, what I call the culinary, culinary racism of empire, you need to connect these spaces, and you'll see different figures, different stories emerge. I think that's one of my goals. In other words, you could tell, I think there's great value in writing microhistories and focusing on that small space in and by itself. But there is also some remit in connecting disparate scales, and then see what emerges in terms of narrative connections.
I mean, what did you find? I mean, that sounds absolutely fascinating. What did you find? I mean, or was there, did you come to some conclusions about this relationship between the cook room, which I'm guessing is a space that's largely overseen by the woman of the house, the colonial house mistress, and these broader geopolitical crises? Because I think that, because when we look at famines, we try and work out the largest scale thing that must be causing it, which is really useful because it means we don't have to take any responsibility at all for it, which is fantastic. That's just what we want. But whereas actually, if you implicate the everyday practices of homemaking, for example, or the work of the mistress of the home in the production of the crisis, then, well, everybody's implicated, everybody's guilty, aren't they? And that's I suppose one of the things it does is it troubles our historical imagination. It creates a sort of dis-ease within that, which is good, which is, as you say, it's about time.
So, the cook room, interestingly, because it was outside the house, was not within direct, control of the mistress of the house, the European woman, which caused, deep anxiety. So there was an effort to bring it within the house or close to the house. It cannot be within because, these are servant spaces, what they do, it's completely, the relations are completely, and deeply racialized and so on and so forth. They're dirty spaces. So I actually have a section on dirt. What does dirt mean in this case, right? What is this anxiety about dirt? But so I was looking at actually, talk of sort of discoveries in the archive. I was looking at this one recipe book. It's somewhere between, a cookbook and a housekeeping guide, written by a colonel in the Madras Army, retired colonel. And it is, all these really fancy cooking that he expects the servants to do. And he's telling the reader how they should be trained to do it and so on and so forth. and you should abandon all those Indian foods because, they're barbaric, etc. And you can read the text now and you can get actually really amused, like, oh, well, that's so kind of blatantly racialized, etc. Then I realized something, I've been looking at this for a long time and I didn't notice it, that it's actually published during the Madras famine. And he's in Madras. So that let me think about what does it mean to produce a book like that which is asking for anywhere between, the least is 6, and for, respectable dinners, 12-course meals, to be produced at that time. What does it mean? Okay, what are we talking about? So I link it to labor. The right to command labor is what is at the sort of core of this. And my argument is much more detailed, but I think if you think about what kind of labor he expects the servants to perform and where they would perform it, it was about the command over labor. Command over food is about the command over labor.
So there's a precision about how you're talking. Sorry for interrupting, but there's a precision about how you're talking about this, which I think is really fascinating. It's sort of becoming the detail at which you're describing even these smaller situations that eschew the kind of grand narrative is small in itself. It's, as you say, it's a cookbook as a source that can actually unpack a whole historical relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, the slave and the master, relationships to, as you say, control of labor, which I think is a really fascinating idea. I was just wondering about, because you also talked about, in the book, you talk about the punkawallas, and the need, for example, in these colonial houses for servants. And there's a kind of dual need here. There's the need to be seen to be someone who can have servants. So there's the kind of, and you mentioned one particular family where they actually basically go bankrupt because they have to have the servants to seem like the kind of people that have servants, but they can't actually afford them. But then there's this other peculiar thing, which is that it's so hot for the colonizers that they feel that they need, what was the number? Something like every room needs punkahs, and you need something like 6. And you need a punkawalla for every room, basically. And so you've got a minimum staff of like 12 people.
So right, and that's for a junior personnel in the army. Okay, think about it. So when you went up the ladder, when you went up to the viceroy, you would have more than 300. So okay, but the fact that ordinary people, ordinary personnel, civil and military, had so many servants, and it's not like it has not been mentioned in different accounts of empire, but what about if we actually take a look at what does it mean in terms of labor? Where do they labor? And I'm just asking, like, where does the labor happen? And through the figure of the punkawalla, for example, in other words, and these are all men who actually fan the European inhabitants of these houses, but they don't sit in that space. This is a space adjacent, and the fan, which is hanging from the ceiling, is suspended from the ceiling, is connected through a wire cord through a hole in the wall, and this person is sitting in a space. Sort of, in other words, you don't want to see the guy, but you want to be fanned by the guy, right? And so, what does it mean? And so, I take apart what does it mean in terms of laboring space, and something that's fascinating in terms of comfort. So this is about oh, India is so hot, right? You always need to be the comfort of the European body, of course, at the expense of the native body, but that is always assumed, right? But here, what interested me is that a certain mode of abstraction, again, that I see unfolding between the early 19th century and late 19th century, when not only, the sort of what we would say middle class men and women are expect to be fanned, okay, which, mind you, didn't pretty much exist in the late 18th century. Somebody had to stand next to you to fan you, okay. So this new fangled thing about hanging fans from the ceiling, by the mid-19th century, we see it in barracks. And now they have to think about they're thinking about the ordinary soldiers, this is the Waltons, that who need to be fanned, if necessary, 24 hours to keep them comfortable. So you think of spaces of the barracks, and these are very large spaces. So they're thinking of a train of these fans. So they're trying to make these calculations of how many of these pankhawalas would you need to fan these men who are sleeping. We're getting into the realm of standardization. We're getting into the realm of calculating efficiency and mechanical efficiency of the laboring bodies, and the creation of what I call the pankhakuli, the fact that these were seasonal labor, and they were a different class of labor emerges because of this perceived need of the European body. And again, my question is, where do these people come from? Where do they actually labor? Why this need suddenly, which wasn't there even in the early 19th century? How does this need emerge? And this I related to the ability and to demand labor, whether it's for bodily comfort, whether it's for food. So that's how I relate, like what happens in the famine camps, what happens to labor. They have to labor if they are going to get food. In other words, without labor, nobody will be given any aid. So what is that figure of labor, and how does the figure of labor work in all these spaces? So if we kind of stack these against each other, the cookroom, the veranda in which the pakhawala labors, the famine camp, and then the unspoken villages from which these famished people were coming, or they were forced to leave their villages because they wouldn't be given aid there. They had to come to the camps to get aid, or come to work at infrastructural projects, canal and railways, to get food. What does it mean once we stack these next to each other, see the connections? What kind of sort of enterprise do we see empire to be? So that's where I'm going. And I think part of my interest, I work on colonialism, so that's the archive, but that's not purely that simple. In other words, it's not simply that I happen to work on the colonial archives, that's where I'm looking at empire. But I think these ideas about command labor, how one commands labor, who gets to command labor, where the spaces of labor are profoundly applicable, and you find it every realm of what we would say modern and contemporary architecture. They've not gone anywhere.
It's not gone anywhere.
So,
and it's a really interesting one, and I'm slowly getting my head around this idea as well. I wanted to ask about Del Upton. I wanted to go back to Del Upton because obviously Del Upton's a vernacularist, folklorist, a wonderful scholar in so many ways. But there's this idea in much of the literature around the vernacular, from Amos Rappaport and Henry Glassy and Paul Oliver and Elizabeth Carter Cromley and people like that, that there is an emergence from the context, but from the socio-cultural, with a heavy emphasis on the social behind architectural form. And it's not, who was it? Thomas Hubker talked about the kind of climate-driven idea about architecture as being essentially the same argument as saying, humans make buildings like birds make nests. It's kind of deeply problematic, actually, when you stand back from it. So Upton and that moment, that social moment in architecture, promotes a much more holistic, much more rooted, much more sensitive much more ethnographic kind of approach. Do you see in the emergence of the architecture of the colonial period, say, for example, in Bengal or in India, do you see a correlational reality? Is this, so for example, the sudden desire for everybody to have a punkawala, is this, to go back to your scale jumping, to use Ajahn Appadurai, is this the top telling people you need to have better ventilation because it's going to be, it's like, being told how to be a good colonizer? Or is there some kind of emergence from the bottom, a kind of awareness that then disseminates across? And more, is there learning from the context itself? Is there, in the plans of the buildings and the forms of the buildings and the way that they operate and the organization of the spaces, some kind of reciprocity between indigenous forms, indigenous practices and knowledges? Or is there, is it in any way a kind of mutual enterprise? If not in a good way, perhaps in a colonial way, like I'm nicking your ideas, like Foucault talks about the French going into North Africa and sort of documenting things, aestheticizing things and nicking them. Did you find any of that?
Oh, if you're looking at the colonial archive, you'll always find that. Okay, that doesn't interest me that much. Okay, because there is no colonial architecture which is not partly indigenous. Okay, it has to be. Okay, because the labor, the materials, the construction techniques. I mean, there's an entire history of that. And I do talk about some of that aspect, because they're relevant to the spaces I am discussing. But I think, let me pick up on one thing you mentioned. There's something, I'm actually intellectually raised by Americanists, James Deeds, De Lupton. And I studied actually American colonial architecture before I studied in a British Empire elsewhere. And there are correlations. Their ideas are moving from one place to another. So you have punkas in the colonial South. Jefferson was thinking about how to get rid of the fan, the person in the slave fanning him or his guests, and how to replace it with a mechanical system, okay, a proper fan, as we would, think about. So, in other words, he's thinking about labor, how he can do certain economies in terms of enslaved labor. He's doing calculations, and he's coming up with a new contraception, like new thing, the mechanical thing that would replace that. That's where I think I clearly see the kind of abstraction that is happening, how labor is being thought of, how conceptions of labor are changing. And yes, the idea for Pankha that he's dealing with what was used in the colonial South comes from South Asia, actually. Okay, so that mode. So in other words, practices travel across the world, and it's not just what Tony King talked about, the bungalow just form and the idea moving, if not the form. It is also, I think, interesting to think about not just appropriation of materials, and that's really important, and techniques. It's about how do you perceive and appropriate the labor and what that labor means. In other words, were Indian elites also doing similar things? After a point, yes. Okay. But even in the early 19th century, unless you were super rich, you did not expect to be fanned all the time. It just didn't happen. And people seem to have survived. Okay. So it's not that, there were Indian practices and here Europeans encountered them and they became something else. Of course, they became something else. Okay. I'm interested in whose terms, what were the costs, and what did it mean in terms of emergent forms of labor. emergent spaces of labor. That's what interests me. Okay. So for Thomas Jefferson, he's trying to get rid of this body of the enslaved in the formal spaces, so he doesn't have to see them. His guests don't have to see him. So it can be sort of behind, in a space where the person need not be seen, or it can be replaced by mechanical equipment. Similarly, what is being made important and visible, and what needs to remain invisible for certain social processes, economic processes to flourish. So the politics of invisibility, the politics of giving value to certain kinds of work and not others, certain kind of bodies and not others, that is of interest to me. And that's what the book is really about. So it's not that, I think we know that anything colonial means there is a lion's share of the indigenous in it, in every form you can think of. So that I accept that. I know that that's an assumption with which I go into the project, because I've done other work on colonial architecture and planning. But I think I'm asking a different set of questions in this book than I've looked at servants, but I'm by foregrounding problem of scale and scalar alterity, the otherness that emerges when we move from one scale to another. When we think about small scale, small spaces. In other words, there is no obvious way of saying, oh, I'm going to just look at a cookroom. How do you go look at a cookroom? Like, these are architecturally undistinguished spaces. Where do you begin? Like, what are you going to start with? Right? You're going to write a history of a closet. Okay, how are you going to go about doing it? Like, what's your method? What's your approach? So I made labor the entree into these spaces. I'm thinking about, how is work shaped in these spaces? How is the space shaped by the work, and vice versa? And that allows me to, connect what very well could be said disparate spaces, spaces of the camp. It could be a military camp. It could be a famine camp. It could be the cookroom. It could be the veranda. It could be portable spaces. Okay, how are they connected? So if we think, we always think of empire as a set of connections. Well, which connections? I think the real story resides in where we see the connections, what connections we make. Because I think we cannot get rid of the responsibility. We, as historians, make the connection. There are no obvious connections. We are constructing those connections. We are privileging certain narratives. So in this book, I privilege certain narratives by focusing on what I call small spaces. And small spaces, smallness here relates to position, location, visibility, durability, duration, a lot of different things. Okay, so in other words, looking at process of marginalization, what does it mean to make something small? Like I said, many of these spaces are not small at all. They are, both in aggregate or by themselves, quite large. In other words, it's not that we are already talking about, closets and microspaces. It's not that simple. Not that writing about closets, it's simple.
It's an interesting approach also to history, because it makes it vigorous for it makes it dynamic, and it makes it broadly applicable to contemporary conditions as well. You can take this approach to any number of contexts in any number of periods. I've been fascinated by what I've found to be the total lack of recognition of, and this might sound controversial. I don't think it is very controversial. The total lack of consideration of the effects of decolonization on the colonizer, particularly on its working class and underprivileged communities. you go around Britain and you go to the poor places which used to produce all the soldiers for the empire, Glasgow's and Liverpool's, and they're very poor, and they suffer from profound long-term pathologies. And I'm not saying, but pity them. I mean, we're talking here about the grandchildren of men who served in the military, and their communities have been sort of, in a way, they are also subject to that colonial mentality, which took their bodies and made them fight and die, or fight and survive, and then when they didn't want them, get rid. And so it's a very useful, I think. Whereas the heroic history tends to pickle things in aspic and place them in the past where they stay, pinned sort of like a butterfly. Instead, what you seem to be doing is generating a technique for doing history that is constantly in the present, because it's constantly a device by which we can comprehend our condition, our present condition.
Yeah. It's actually, your point is absolutely, correct in terms of the impact on the so-called colonizer. When I write about European soldiers and the deep elite European anxiety about their drinking habits, and a few scholars have written about that, and it fascinates me. What I say, the prodigious drinking that happened in bungalows and elite establishments, there's no anxiety about that, hardly any anxiety about that. But why is it that, there's so much anxiety about European soldiers and subalterns drinking? There are caricatures, there are reams of writing. So what's going on? So my understanding is that, and obviously coming from a spatial point of view, it's not that they're drinking, it's where they're drinking, with whom they're drinking, because they are much more prone to cross racial boundaries, ethnic boundaries, religious boundaries, and makes them very dangerous. So that's a real fear of contamination, of productive contamination. So it's very evident in the narratives of how you think about rationing and controlling.
To control the possibilities of encounter, and therefore the possibilities, I suppose, of fellow feeling developing, which would undercut the entire imperial project.
It would, yeah. It would. And where would the soldiers go to find their liquor? To the bazaar.
Yeah.
Okay. Where would they socialize with? Well, heck, Indian women. Okay. And of course, we know what will happen. God forbid, the world will fall apart, right? Well, yes, the imperial enterprise will be deeply shaken. Okay. Because
they're not wrong in that. They're not wrong in that.
No, they're absolutely not wrong in there. Absolutely not. So, so this is what I call the insidiousness. So when I look at trade, I'm looking at alcohol and food, canned and bottled provisions. So I wanted to see, why are they so both privileged, and why is there so much anxiety about this? Okay, what is so important? Is it the expense? No, it's not expense. It's use. Who controls them? Their signification. Like, wow, okay, I did not think, an item of canned food was that important. Clearly, it was. Okay, so those are, I would actually say, even for me, were discoveries. Like, really, this is that serious? Then I have to construct, why is it that serious? How do I, relate it to trade histories of empire? And there's, great works on trade histories of empire. Nobody connects it to what one could say microdynamism of power, or these different scales. Okay, so what happens when I think you find you make room for the stories of the subalterns, the sailors, the Indian servants, and European women and Indian women in there. Okay, so, and are they not connected to the elite men or women? Of course they are. they're not separate entities. But the question is what you privilege. I do not begin with the famous men. I do not, that's not my entry point. I don't begin with the famous spaces. They're invoked, but they're not central to my rumination about space and empire.
That's a great point to finish on. Thank you, Swati, so much.
Thank you so much. This was a privilege, and I look forward to further conversations.
Tagore said, "I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was service. I acted and behold, service was joy." Well, so is that conversation, and so is the book. Thanks to Swati for taking the time to speak with me, and to Bloomsbury for the wonderful book. Links to it and to Swati's professional profile are in the podcast description as ever. Thanks for listening.